I'm Kate Anderson, a project director and associate fellow here at the Brookings Institution. And I'm going to invite up our panelists to talk about regional networks. So Esther gave a great background on the global movement. We'll hear about the country research that we've done, but kind of in the middle, tying it together, are the regional networks that can really help move things forward. So if I could have Darius and Mesa and Ramia and Mercedes join me up here. Thank you. So as we're getting the mics working, when we first got started doing this work, we heard a couple times people would ask, is this really something that's happening in the US, maybe in Europe, maybe in high-income countries, OECD countries, but around the rest of the world, is this really happening, or is this something that's kind of coming from the so-called global north? And being pushed down. And so I think, as Esther explained, we're really saying that this is a truly global movement. And while some of the global organizations have had a role, it's really at the regional level where we're seeing a lot of activity of countries learning from each other, connecting, and coming up with new ways and innovative ways of approaching the skills agenda. So these regional networks can help generate efficiencies when you have a group of countries that all use the same language, such as in Latin America. There's ways to think about this as far as learning materials and assessment materials that can be done together in the region. There's also groups such as the African Union or ADEA, the Association for the Development of Education in Africa, that brings together ministers and government leaders that can really put pressure on countries. Also informal networks, just bringing together several countries that are interested in an issue. So you have the bios of our panelists, but I just want to mention a couple words about why they're joining us today. So first we have Mesa Jalbout. She's the CEO of the Abdullah Al Ghurair Foundation and has done quite a bit of research on skills in the Arab world as a non-resident fellow here at Brookings and in other roles. Next we have Darius Magaka Ogutu. He's the Director of Education in charge of Policy, Partnerships, and East Africa Affairs in the Ministry of Education in Kenya. He wears many hats, and you'll actually see him later talking about the work he's doing in Kenya. But this morning he's here to talk about his role in several inter-country quality nodes on math and science education and on peace education in Kenya. And these bring together interested governments in the Africa region to think about a certain issue and develop strategies for implementation. Ramia Vivekanandan is a program specialist in the section for inclusive quality education at UNESCO Bangkok. And she has been the head of secretariat for several years, since about 2012, for the NECMAP, the Network on Education Quality Monitoring in the Asia Pacific, which Esther mentioned earlier. So she's going to tell us. It's a quite established network regionally, and the focus has been on skill development quite a bit. And finally, we have Mercedes Miguel, Secretary of Innovation and Quality Education in the Ministry of Education and Sports in Argentina. Again, someone who wears many hats and has done quite a bit of work when she was working in the city of Buenos Aires and now at the national level. But in her spare time has also been convening governments around Latin America to get together and talk about the issues of skills. She was quite active in the Learning Metrics Task Force that we convened with UNESCO and has been continuing that work. So I first want to just get started by asking, what is the state of affairs? We've heard about what's happening globally with the Sustainable Development Goals. They include a focus on skills, among other things. So what's happening in your regions in response to this, or what's already been happening? So let's start with Darius, who just returned from the ADEA Triennial in Dakar, Senegal last month. It convened education ministers from all over the African continent. Were skills on the agenda there, and can you tell us a little bit about what's been happening in Africa?
Thank you. We held our ADEA Triennial in Dakar, Senegal from 14th to 17th March this year. And we were glad to be hosted by President Macky Sall of Senegal, who happens to be the chair of the 10 Africa champions, especially on education, science, and technology. And during the ADEA Triennial, skills was the focus. Issues about employability and the future of the African youth. And we were focusing on the agenda Sustainable Development Goals 2030, as well as Agenda 2063, and trying to address issues around how we can prepare the African youth for the future and for employable skills. The key issue here was bringing together policymakers in the form of heads of state, ministers in charge of education, science, and technology, and senior ministry officials, and UN agencies, NGOs, civil society, teachers, unions and associations, all those stakeholders working around education to share ideas on what has worked elsewhere, best practices, present research evidence, and be able to strategize on way forward, how best to address the issues of skills gap in the continent. And there are several initiatives that are already being proposed. One of the initiatives that member countries are working on is the intercountry quality nodes, and we have several of these. I happen to be the chair of the intercountry quality node on maths and science, as well as the intercountry quality node on peace education. These are hosted in Kenya, and I'm also part of the intercountry quality node on teaching and learning that is hosted by the Republic of Rwanda. The whole idea of intercountry quality nodes is to have member countries lead the discussion on issues of concern around those key areas. And these are government-led, and we are able to bring on board other partner states that are interested in that area to try and share best knowledge that we have, best practices, see what is we can replicate across the continent, or what we can learn from the others. If I try out something and I fail, I do not have to watch you try the same and fail and tell you later that I knew you were going to fail. The idea is for me to tell you that, oh, the road you're taking is bumpy ahead. Maybe you could take a detour and it would be much more smoother. So technically, it's sharing what works and pushing it up all to the highest decision makers in the continent under the African Union Commission, so that the heads of state get to hear from the ministers in charge of education, those in charge of science and technology, on what the technocrats are working on and what is working, and therefore adopt policies that are aimed to bring about change in the African continent.
Thank you. And we look forward to hearing more about what Kenya has been doing in response and what you've learned. Mercedes, skills have been on the agenda in Latin American region for quite some time. Can you give us a little history and an update on where things are now?
Well, the truth is that Latin America is a very active region, and pedagogically speaking, there has been many attempts of innovating, and I should say that there are countries like Chile and Mexico and Brazil that have been pushing forward more than others. In Argentina and Buenos Aires City, when we were at the Buenos Aires City Ministry of Education, we pushed very hard to implement different visions of how to work, and not only the contents in the curriculum, but how to work at school level. I think that the huge challenge that we have in the region, maybe because of how powerful the teachers, the unions, and the students are in terms of having great discussions. When we discuss all together, and all the voices are raised. So this maybe takes a lot of time in having discussions. I think that a great challenge it has been, and I think that is what Chile, Mexico, and Brazil did very well, is to plan the discussion and to have finally regulations, laws, and documents that could trace the pathway. What we are doing right now in Argentina is to unite all those great things. Peru, it's another country that has done a lot in terms of innovation and changes in curriculum and education system in vision. They have worked a lot with, I know that they have been working with people from Finland and Singapore. So in Argentina, and when we were in Buenos Aires City, we're very eager to learn from others. And that is something that I want to say how good is for the countries and global cities who are trying to implement, how good is to have this kind of project. So congratulations to Brookings Institution. It's very good for us to learn from others. In the region, we are trying to, Buenos Aires City and now in Argentina, we are always trying to make these networks and meetings so that we can share what we are doing. Regarding to skills, there is a lot to do in the region. We are, I think, Argentina and the region, because I am part of UNESCO 2030 agenda. I represent Latin America in the steering committee. And although Brazil and Mexico, they are huge and they really push the region, we are 12 countries and we have to work together. So we organized a meeting in Buenos Aires last December, and one of the main topics of the agenda was how are we going to implement in our systems the skills vision, because the first phase is to know about them. Esther showed us how present they are in the discussions, in the conversations, in the documents, but the truth is, how are we going to get those skills inside every student daily lessons and every teacher daily plans? So I think that's a huge challenge that we have.
Can I ask another question? So, you know, a lot of times we've heard that teachers are very discontent with needing to focus on literacy and numeracy alone and seeing the need for other skills but not having the space in the curriculum. Darius, I think that was the story I heard about you, was why you went into the government to begin with from being a teacher. So now, you know, that the countries are looking at a broader approach, what challenges are, you know, what opinions still remain that would be kind of counter to the skills approach?
That's a good question. Yesterday, we've been working in a room the whole day, a group of very interesting colleagues and countries. And one of the topics was exactly what you were saying. The curriculum and the learning space at school, it's physically, it has 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. It starts and ends today. In 2, 3 years, at least, the whole school learning is going to be an application in the cell phone. So there are not going to be any more frontiers for learning, the new learning spaces and time. But today, the curriculum, it has a determinate quantity of amount of subjects that you can have and an amount of teachers that you can get inside the classroom to teach one student. So I think that the biggest challenge here is to rethink what we are doing inside the classroom. It's not, in Argentina, we are moving out from subjects planning towards skills planning. So instead of having one student facing and getting 8 teachers, maths, biology, chemistry, geography, arts, language, whatever, they come and go. And it's like, now maths, now biology, now chemistry. They are not learning like that anymore. They go out and they make 400 movies. My 13-year-old girl and my 9 and 11, I have 3 girls. They are producing and learning and asking them each other, what is it about this and that? They are not acquiring information and learning like this. And that is what is going on inside the classroom. So we have to rethink how are we going to introduce skills and subjects and values. It's all together. So I cannot think of a teacher for communication skill, a teacher for creative skills, a teacher for how to learn with others. So the huge challenge here is how are we going to train our teachers and how are we going at government level, plan, strategy to deliver this change. I'm thinking of Michael Barber right now, deliverology. This is a huge challenge, because we cannot keep on thinking that in a curriculum we will have chemistry, physics, communication, learning with others, collaborative work, peer. It's not a subject anymore. It's a learning process that students have, for me, to experience the learning, and the teachers to experience the teaching as a whole. What is worth learning today? And the how, not the what, but the how are our students going to acquire that learning is the huge challenge for me.
That's actually a good segue to Mesa, who has all the answers. No, but who has done research on the skills gap and how technology can potentially bridge the skills gap in the Arab world. So Mesa, you published the report last year and highlighted various technology initiatives. What's happening in the region now? Have you seen any of these recommendations implemented?
Sure, but before I answer that question, I just wanted to step back a little bit and sort of say that the skills movement in the Arab world, so across 22 states, has been sort of characterized by 3 different phases. One goes back to the sort of low level of learning outcomes across the region, and this actually was framed very well in a report produced by us here at Brookings called the Arab Learning Barometer, in which we had found that while we'd gained quite a bit of progress in terms of access to education, it was the quality and learning outcomes where there was the biggest challenge. So 50% of students who are actually in school were not attaining basic learning outcomes. And that's a huge anchor to the discussion around skills, because this is where governments are primarily concerned about basic literacy skills and math skills. So much of the concern and discussion in government is around that low level of attainment. And that can be seen in sort of all global measures. For example, in PISA's results in 2015, of the 6 Arab countries who were participating, only 1 country, Qatar, I believe, was the one that showed some progress in basic skills. The second is one that's connecting the learning outcomes to the workplace. And given that there's such a huge youth population, over 100 million young people in the region, there is a massive concern around the impact of that quality of learning on the connection to the job market and the resulting massive unemployment. And so the connection to work skills was extremely important, and this is another major concern. And how do you make education relevant to the work environment and the basic skills that you need, basic working skills, such as being able to work independently, working together, thinking critically? All of those are important. And they connect, obviously, to the breadth of skills that we're talking about. And then I come to the third level of concern, which is how are young people in the region prepared for the changing world that we live in, the interconnected world, the one dominated by technology, where jobs are changing so rapidly. And there is a massive concern around the fact that young people not only lack some basic skills, but are not necessarily prepared for that transition for jobs of the future. So now there's quite a bit of work around preparing young people for having the types of skills they need to engage in a more interconnected world. So media literacy, digital literacy, English language learning skills, which is the primary language of working in a global community. So characterized by these three sort of levels. And I'm encouraged because we're starting to see some work and some progress in using technology, which is coming back to the report that we produced just recently, around using technology to bridge that gap. So for example, the foundation that I work at, we're trying to use online learning to provide young people with opportunity to upskill. So those who have actually gone through the education phase but have not necessarily gained some of those skills that will allow them to work in the jobs that are coming into the job market. And one other example I would say is related to quantifying and evaluating the types of skills young people have and actually being able to recognize them. So an example of that would be an initiative by IDRAK, which is a Queen Rania initiative that is working with employers and with a job skills website called bait.com that is giving badges to young people that actually go through certain online courses such as MOOCs in order to give employers a sense of what kinds of skills these young people have. And those are just some examples, but signs of some growth in that area.
Right. And so I think, what we've heard so far is that in order for us to get different outcomes in the skills, we really need to rethink how we teach the skills. And Ramya, I know you have been doing some work on those topics. Tell us a little bit about the work in the Asia-Pacific region around transversal skills.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. So actually, I should start by saying that for UNESCO, how we define Asia-Pacific is actually, it's a huge sort of diversity in number of countries, so including South Asia, East Asia, both Northeast and Southeast, the Pacific, as well as Central Asia. So actually 48 different countries, 2/3 of the world's population. And we're sitting in Bangkok as a regional office covering all of these countries. So obviously there's a great deal of diversity. But actually for UNESCO as the coordinating agency for the Education 2030 agenda, and prior to that the EFA agenda, I think all of the discussions that took place leading up to the adoption of the Education 2030 agenda in Incheon in 2015, already there was a strong sense across the region, regardless of the level of development of country, that we should be thinking of a much more expanded notion of skills and moving beyond the cognitive domains. And I think in August of 2014, we had our last sort of regional high-level meeting to provide the inputs of the region into the Incheon of the World Education Forum. And there was something called the Bangkok Statement that came out of that meeting. So there, I think it was sort of very formally encapsulated this idea that as a region, we conceive of skills as being much more than the traditional, literacy and numeracy, and talking about exactly the areas that Esther was mentioning in terms of communication and critical thinking and creativity and being able to live and work with others. So this was already very much the thinking, I think, of the Asia Pacific, even prior to Incheon. And then when you look at the level of particular countries, I think almost all of them, when you look at their national vision statements or mission statements for education, as well as the broad sort of policy statements, you find very much this perspective reflected. So in countries as diverse as, say, Singapore, where in their what they call the desired outcomes for education, they talk very much about these areas such as moral integrity, such as being able to work with others, such as being able to communicate. A country like Bhutan, kind of on the other end of the spectrum, also when you look at their national education blueprint, it talks very much about the same types of desired outcomes of what learners should have. So I think that then from a regional perspective for UNESCO, as Esther mentioned, so we've been working, looking at what we call the transversal competencies, really since 2013, and starting with by leveraging a network that we have called the Education Research Institutes Network, which is essentially a group of universities and research institutions in the region that are working in education. And so there were actually 3 studies, 3 phases of work that were done looking at the so-called transversal competencies, which were framed very much along the diagram that Esther showed in her presentation. So the first phase was really looking at the policy level, really, what's the overall thinking of countries as far as this whole agenda is concerned. The second phase looked very much at school and teacher practice. And then the third phase, the report of which was just published last year, was looking more at the impact of all of this on teacher development and training. And so I think that overall, some of the findings to highlight from all of that would be that many countries are primarily focused on creativity and innovation, and then interpersonal skills as kind of the 2 main sort of subsets of these competencies that they're deemed to be important. And also a lot of this, I think, in the region is driven by actually kind of more the economic discourse and actually what Mesa was referring to in terms of being able to connect that to the world of work and rationalizing transversal competencies in terms of preparing learners for that. But then I think a lot of this work really showed then the disconnect between kind of these broad vision and policy statements and then the realities of how teachers who are committed to this in theory, but how they can actually, move towards this in their everyday practice. And then assessment, of course, was kind of another big missing link. So then the last piece of work that we did on this, which focused on assessment, leveraged another network that we have called NECMAP, which, as you mentioned, is a regional network on assessment that I coordinate from our office in Bangkok. And so this piece of work, which was coordinated by Esther, we published it just a few months ago. And again, I think the main findings were simply that even though many countries actually have in their national assessment frameworks or other sort of policy level documents a commitment to assessing these other areas, there's a big gap in terms of how you actually do that. Capacity gap, and then also just not access to tools and instruments, either because they don't exist or because they're not known or other challenges. So I think that by leveraging these 2 networks, we've been able to really kind of look at this from a systematic point of view across a number of very diverse countries. And so we're looking forward to continuing that work. I did bring a few copies of the report, which I'll leave at the back of the room.
Thank you. So as Esther pointed out, we started our investigation of skills policies with a couple hypotheses. One was that a country would first start maybe by making a political statement, identifying the mission and vision and including skills there, then identifying the specific skills that they want to focus on, including those in the curriculum, whether through a reform or some sort of other process, and then finally by articulating how those skills are intended to progress. But we know that the reality is not so straightforward. So I wanted to see maybe what our panelists think about why this might not be true. So Mesa, do you have any thoughts on why we don't see that kind of logical progression in the MENA region? Countries like Bahrain mention skills in their mission and vision statements, but not in the curriculum, and the opposite is true in the UAE. Why might that be the case?
So I think one of the reasons is because there's a disconnect between the vision and implementation. And that's probably, goes back to what I was just talking about earlier, where the concern on a day-to-day basis in the ministry is really focused on basic learning outcomes, whereas the country, of course, aspires, to be globally competitive and producing young people who are able to not only obtain, the jobs in the 21st century, but to create jobs and to be entrepreneurial. So always the aspirations are much higher than implementation. But part of the reason that there's this disconnect is the pressure that is often on the Ministry of Education, which sometimes manifests itself in continuous change of the Minister of Education and the senior level that's there. So a lot of starts and stops again, which I imagine is common across all of our regions here. Also, the other thing is that often a vision and a mission of the human resource development of a country, aims for best practice, but there is a huge gap to where the country is, and there are several steps that are missing in the implementation, in the framework. And perhaps also a disconnect where the emphasis is on what the education sector is producing, but some of these responsibilities will fall on other ministries, so Ministry of Labor or Ministry of Community Development, and the disconnect between the different ministries. And finally, I would just say that one of the issues as well is perhaps a lack of a framework for assessing skills, which is why I think that the work that around the breadth of skills is so important, is how do all of these things connect together so that you are producing a holistic individual that can carry all of those skills. And how do we connect what's happening in school with what's happening outside of school? So often we look at formal skills development through the education sector, but much of those skills that we're talking about are implemented by organizations outside of the Ministry of Education, especially in the Middle East. I would say civil society organizations carry a huge load.
And Mercedes, in Latin America, the curriculum is often decentralized down to the school or even classroom level in some cases. So how does a typical reform roll out in a country where you have, the school heads and teachers making the decisions on curriculum, not at the national level?
Well, it depends on the country. Latin America has many different kind of systems. Some countries are very centralized and they define the curriculum at national level, and that is. Other countries, like in Chile or Peru, they have given more autonomy to the schools, and they can recruit their teachers, and they can have each school its own curriculum. Argentina, we have the 3 levels. There is a national definition curriculum level. Then each province, we have 24 provinces. It's a federal system. Then each province writes its own curriculum, and then the schools apply what the province has said. It depends on the countries, and this is what makes it more difficult when we get together the whole region to discuss implementation. Each country has to plan different kind of strategies, but I think that those who were absolutely decentralized are trying to get back to some kind of national framework regarding to the student that they want to have, the graduate outcome of the students. What student do they want when the school is finished? So this is the question that we are trying to work each of our countries. And when we sit together to think as a region about curriculum or learning or skills reforms, I see that there is a big lack of strategy in planning reforms. As we were seeing, the skills are around the world we are talking about skills, we are writing about skills, we are investigating about skills, but there is not a strategy on how are we going to track and assess those skills. And it's exactly as you were saying, there is a huge lack of frameworks for assessing. So when a country or a global city or a school wants to start this kind of reform, there is a huge lack, at least in Argentina and in the region. It was very difficult for us the universities are not ready to train the teachers in a skills-based planification. And there aren't national or international frameworks for assessing skills. Some huge assessing teams are starting. PISA it has a future skills developing team working on the new skills that they are going to start assessing. Bogotá in Colombia did an amazing work, and they started assessing some kind of well-being skills at the student level. But these are tiny things that are appearing. I think that teacher training, assessing, and planning implementation is very important. And although we are working in Argentina to give schools more autonomy, you have to be prepared to give autonomy. Because if not, you are just telling them what to do, and you are not giving the professional support on how to do it. So back again, I insist in planning the strategy of implementation. Now this, then this, then this, and here I'm going to assess you. And during the process, giving support. Because if not, the schools and the teachers are not ready to work on a skills concept or vision, I think.
And that brings us to another hypothesis that we had, that when a country is undergoing a reform, that the issues of curriculum, assessment, and pedagogy would be tackled at the same time altogether, and that's not always the case. So maybe we could go to Ramya, and is this the case in the countries that you work with in the Asia Pacific region? Is there one area that countries tend to tackle first, or are some doing kind of all three at the same time, and what does that look like?
Mm-hmm. I think it really varies from country to country, but generally we feel that it's been fairly disjointed. I think curriculum, probably more than the other areas, has had more attention with countries following different approaches, whether that's actually setting aside standalone subjects for some of these areas, or integrating within existing subjects, or looking at extracurricular ways of integrating these skills. But there are, I think now in a number of countries, efforts being made to actually integrate a breadth of skills within the curriculum. But I think when you look at teaching and teacher training in particular, it's still not sort of on the same pace, I think for various reasons. To the extent that teacher training does address, preparing teachers to think about how to teach these new skills, I think it's more in service, and it's more project-driven and more ad hoc. I think most countries in our region haven't really reformed their fundamental systems of teacher education, particularly pre-service, to really address this area. And then when you look at assessment, I think we're even further behind in the sense that there's just not really that much that's happened, even though with our research that we did with Esther, we did see that in some countries, there's some efforts being made. But I think fundamentally there's a big disconnect really between how now having a much more holistic vision of what types of skills our learners need to have and what education is all about. But then, as other panelists have also mentioned, really this assessment piece, where we're still very much kind of very traditional in terms of how we conceive of measurement and evaluation. And that's certainly the case when you look at public examinations in most countries, but even in non-high stakes types of assessments, national assessments or regional or international, there are, of course, some attempts with what PISA has been doing recently with the collaborative problem solving, and soon on global competence, for example. But I think most of these tend to not really be connected very much with what's happening in countries and really in the classroom. So I think this is really kind of the piece that we have to focus much more on in the next phase.
Great. And Darius, we heard last time that we were in Kenya, the prior curriculum reforms, it seemed like were never fully implemented, and with the new reforms coming in, is that something that happens where maybe a curriculum reform starts and then it never gets to the point of full implementation before another one comes in? Or tell us a little bit about kind of some of the issues with that.
Well, the typical situation in a Kenyan school or Kenyan classroom is that a teacher has a textbook, there is a syllabus, and you have 30 minutes or 40 minutes within which to do something with the children, and within a given term or year, you're supposed to have completed the syllabus and covered what is in the textbook. So typically, it's a race to complete, to cover the syllabus, or to go through the textbook. So we do not look into what skills will the children have acquired by the end of it, or are they expected to acquire. So in most situations as a teacher, and I'm a trained teacher, I will make an effort to use my 40 minutes or 30 minutes in the class to enable me cover the syllabus. Because at the end of the year, I'll be assessed based on syllabus coverage and not much on whether the children have gained any skills. And so we set out to change this in the reform process, and so that we can open up instruction in the classroom to be more skill-based than just an issue of how much content we've covered. And the interesting thing is that the discussion has been hot in terms of, are we going to reduce the subjects? Are we going to increase the subject? Are we going to bring on board new aspects? And so the debate ranges around subjects, but we want it to range around skills. What skills do we want the children to acquire? And how do we determine whether these skills have been acquired? If I'm in a classroom and I teach, by the end of the lesson, how do I ascertain that what I intended has been achieved? And so it becomes critical, because even as you propose reforms and you try to bring on board new ways of doing things, then you have to realize that pedagogy has a stake at this. And the pedagogical approaches in most cases, if it's just textbook-based, syllabus-based, then you've got to change the mindset of teachers. The interesting thing is there is a whole cohort of already practicing teachers whom you've got to train to bring on board to the new thinking. And that, in most cases, is where we fail. We come up with new reforms. We think it's going to be new because we've a document that details that to be new. But my teaching approaches, how I do it in class, is the same old way I was taught to do it. So we fail again, not because the reforms are not good, but we do not prepare the teachers well. We do not support them. We do not create an environment where that reform can be implemented. And the interesting thing is that in Kenya, for example, and as in most African countries, we determine success or failure based on the score you get in a national examination. So based on that score, then I'm placed in the next level of education. Then I go to university or proceed to secondary, and then I am deemed to have passed or to have excelled in a certain level. But the situation here is, how do teachers assess that learning has taken place, that skills have been acquired? And so under the Learning Metrics Task Force, as part of the African Learning Champions, we set out to see what it is that can encompass this breadth of skills that we expect a holistic kind of approach to look like. And we brought together teachers, civil society, ministry officials, and quality assurance and standards officers. And I must mention here, the quality assurance and standards officers are the ones who go to school to see whether learning is taking place. But when they get to school, they check your schemes of work, your lesson plan, your record of work, to see whether you've completed the syllabus or you're on track. They have no way of determining whether the children actually learned or acquired any skills. So we got together with a number of countries and realized we're facing the same kind of challenges. And under the Network for Assessment of Learning in Africa, NALA, we're trying to look at a common set of tools of determining whether learning has taken place at various levels. And to enable us compare, even at institutional level, you are able to look at your school and your classroom and tell whether the children are acquiring certain salient skills. And you have a way in which to compare maybe with others and be able to provide some remedial or some kind of support to those children who are not able to achieve this. Part of the reforms we are proposing, for example, is on value-based education, that we have to inculcate values in the system. But then, how do you teach values? How do you assess values? How does a teacher tell that a child has acquired certain values over a period of time? And these are key questions that we're looking at, and hoping that through NALA, through bringing together regional member states, we can share ideas, we can share findings, and maybe tools that enable us to compare and look across the breadth of skills that children are supposed to have acquired, so that I don't wait for the end or the summative examination to tell me that this number of children have failed. But in the course of the teaching, I'm able to tell that my children are weak on this area, I need support in this area, and I'm flexible enough to seek help. The other disease we suffer from is that it is my class, and I'm competing against Kate, I'm competing against Mercedes. So I have to, it's like I'm on my own lane. It's a race against Mercedes, against Kate, and everybody is aiming to cross the finishing line. But we're realizing that is not the idea. The idea is to be able to look across and see, Kate is struggling. Can I be able to give her a hand? And Mercedes has a better idea. How can I use her idea in enhancing my teaching in this class? So the reform process right now, we're embarking on coming up with a new curriculum. And we are facing this huge task of changing the teacher's mindset in terms of collaborative learning and teaching, peer teaching, so that they can get support from within the institution. And by the time the national government comes in, or the county government comes in, and the other support system, it's already an ecosystem that is open and friendly to suggestions and friendly to change, so that I do not have to say, this is how I was taught, this is how I do it, and this is how I'm going to continue doing it. If it's not working, then I can as well try something else new. So currently, we are projecting that it's going to be successful, because we are making a provision for making sure that all the teachers, at least we get to reach all the teachers in terms of preparing them for change. And in most cases, we are resistant to change, because we think either change will not favor us or will be much more, add more workload onto our already stretched workload. But we want to motivate the players in the system and give them this kind of hoping for something higher than just getting a score on a score sheet for my children, but then I'm preparing for the future generation.
Listening to you talk and all of you talking about the challenges and thinking about the top skills that we found are priorities for children to be learning, the communication, collaboration, problem solving, creativity, it seems like if those working on the reforms had maybe more of some of those skills, we could get there a lot quicker. Great. So I think at this point we'll open up to the audience for questions, and we have some microphones back there if anyone has questions for the panelists. I see Seamus up here and Josh and Martin.
Thank you. Are there examples of countries where transversal skills have been incorporated into high-stakes assessments? And if not, does it matter?
Great. Let's take a round of questions, maybe 4, and then, so I think we have Josh over there, and Marguerite, and Martin. We'll do those 4.
Hi, Joshua Muskin from Geneva Global. Thank you all very much. I have a feeling that we're looking at this from 10,000 feet or 10,000 meters. And my fear is that system solutions, which we all are sort of obligated to work with, risk undermining classroom solutions. And Darius, you started getting at this at the end of your last intervention, talking about getting teachers, not just with the proper mindset, but giving them the proper tools to be able to do this. And just as an illustration of a system solution, I was involved in one country where a major international donor helped the country come up with a relevance curriculum for the whole country. One curriculum supposed to be relevant in the desert, on the coast, with the fisher people, in the cities, in the rural areas, and the like. So we talk about assessment, we talk about curriculum, and that what I'm hearing you talk around, Darius, is how do we not just give a curriculum that teachers can use with a new mindset, but how do we give a curriculum that teachers can use creatively, can manipulate, can discard some of, add to, and also with assessment. If we're assessing creativity at a system level, we're really handicapped in being able to assess across creativity because we can't distinguish between the student who's creative in mathematics, who's creative in arts, who's creative in literature, and the rest. And just very quickly, at Geneva Global, we're working with an accelerated education model, condensing 3 years, the first 3 years of primary into 1 year to equip the kids to go straight into 4th grade with great results. We're doing this because the teachers are being able to bring their own solutions to assessing, feedback, and remediation, being able to select creatively from or judiciously from the curriculum, and the planning people at the ministries and at the regional areas love it. The curriculum people are very suspicious because it's telling them that what you have as a curriculum really is not as critical as you think it is. So I'd love some illustrations of how to bring what you're talking about from 10,000 feet or meters down to the classroom. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's, okay, go ahead. I think we had, yeah.
I'm Urvashi from India, and thank you for the panel. It was very interesting. My question is that I agree with the gentleman who went before me, that we've been talking a lot about how teachers are resistant and they're very tied into the curriculum and to the syllabus, and so there's no space in the classroom or in their minds on how to do this. My question is that and that teacher training is not yet up to it. But also the kind of pedagogy that is used in teacher training, does that help to create the same breadth of skills in the teachers? Is it geared towards that? And I think that's where it's lacking. And secondly, I didn't hear enough about higher education and what it's expecting from what does it respect? What kind of certification, what kind of skill? If it's still expecting a certification that says that they know their math and it's very subject-oriented, then there's a contradiction between them. Schools don't know what to do because you're shortchanging your children if you're not preparing them for higher education. And on the other hand, you're supposed to do these breadth of skills, which they agree with, but don't know what to do when it comes to their children getting into colleges and universities after that. So
let's do Martin and Marguerite, and then we'll go back to the panelists.
Martin Henry, Education International. I feel a bit like a Greek chorus here, but it's great to hear about the teachers and the perspective that is thrown into the discussion through that route. I do think that teachers are the biggest way that you make change and create the biggest difference. So I'd just like to look at the assessment issue for a minute, because a number of the conversations we've been having have been around assessment as a summative, hard-end, sort of a glass panel empiricism type tool. And I'd like us to think about shifting gear for a minute around the sort of formative assessment that might happen around competencies. Or if you go back to the DeSecco work, it was always discussed around student self-assessment and student peer assessment. And that is an area where I think you can get into competencies in a way which gives students more agency, more control, and more relation to their teacher in the discussion they're having about the way they're developing those skills. So I think if we look at the sort of skills we're talking about, and I'm talking particularly around the social and emotional area and around the key competencies area, isn't it a more sensible thing for us to think about how teachers can help facilitate the students' ability to look at themselves in terms of those competencies and how they might move along those competencies through the years and over time in a way that has a framework that gives them a way of thinking about where they stand. Thanks.
And directly back, second to the last row.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Marguerite Clark. I'm with the World Bank. First, thank you to the panel for a very interesting, useful discussion. My question is about the role of evidence in implementing a lot of the ideas that you've been talking about. I think it goes partly to the comments that Mercedes was making about implementation. I think these are all great ideas, but there's risk involved. And if I'm a parent, I would worry if my child was exposed to a curriculum that maybe is wonderful at developing skills and competencies, but is not going to prepare them to get into a university or succeed in the certification and traditional systems that still exist. So in terms of trying to engage society, not just educators, around these ideas, to what extent have any of the panelists worked with maybe doing small-scale impact evaluations, bringing to bear research and evidence to the agenda and the discussion to convince people that, yes, this works, it has value, and it will make the future better for your children and for all of us. Thank you.
So we have a few questions here. I'll just repeat them, and then whoever wants to go. Examples of countries where transversal skills have been included in high-stakes assessment, how we cope when system solutions aren't working, and how to bring it down to the classroom level, how to make sure that the kinds of pedagogy and the teachers themselves have the breadth of skills needed to teach these skills, and several comments on, you know, the higher education or even secondary education in some countries where there's high stakes exams and that measure more traditional skills. How do you juxtapose those? And then if any of you have done any research on and have any evidence on some of these approaches, and again, formative assessment as well.
I would
Let's start with Mercedes, and then
I would
Lisa.
like to say, before we keep on talking, like in theory, everything that we are doing and discussing and planning regards to human beings, very tiny little children that are getting inside a system when they are 3, 4, 5, and going out when they are 18. We are thinking about 2030, and those kids are sitting today in kindergarten in year 4. So this is not futurology. We have to plan a strategy based on evidence. What is the best for them? For them, as a mother, as professionals, as scientists, as researchers, we are talking about kids who are going to be the future leaders of our nations. The biggest evidence that we have, and I am going to talk regarding to Argentina, it's global and local. The global evidence is that the economies and the societies and the way that we are living, humans are being tracked by technologies. Artificial intelligence, robots, they are already among us. The jobs have changed and will keep on changing. So you are worried about universities. Universities are in huge crisis altogether with school systems, because the way that we are delivering content and information must change towards a worth life way of learning. Keep on learning all the time. So what we are trying to do here, as Jairus was giving us a perfect picture of what is going on in any classroom, it's not only in Kenya. What he described is any classroom in any part of the world. And changing that, of course, has to do with how are we going to train teachers. Teachers teach in the way they have learned. So if we keep on having teachers sitting on a bench attending to a lecture, they will do exactly the same thing for the rest of their lives. So we have like a two double entrance to really impact on the way that we need to impact to make this reform. This is grassroots transformation. Those who already are teaching, the state, the government invests tons of millions of dollars in training teachers every day. We have 1 million teachers teaching daily in Argentina. But we also have to pay attention to those who are studying to become a teacher. Are we going to let them keep on studying as they are studying so that then when they go back in the system, they will have a crisis with the 21st century skills that are not being touched? And then I would like to say that it's not subjects versus skills. We are not, I think we shouldn't have these kind of discussions. We should really hug skills, competencies, and subjects all together. The students are human beings, that they already have their values, emotions. The thing is that we are trying to see how are we going to plan that inside a classroom and how are we going to assess that. But the kids already have emotional skills. The kids know how to work together. You give a group of kids a ball and they start playing football and they know and they understand what it's like learning with others and peer learning. They do it more naturally. So I would like to say that the huge challenge that we have is how are the systems going to, in the theory, in the evidence that we need to plan and the strategy that we need to make this change. There is a generation right now that we have of teachers that we have to train, but the becoming teachers must have this new envision of what we are doing. And just to finish, regarding to assessment, I think there are two big kind of dimensions of assessing. There is the huge national, international, big, very expensive assessment for educational systems. And then the one that we really need is a summative, daily, simple way of tracking learning outcomes. Assessment is to see if our students are learning and to see if our teachers are doing well. So I would like to keep these two dimensions very, not separately, but because they are not, because any kind of huge assessment that we do it in our classroom with our students. But I would like to say that it's a huge challenge in how are we going to teach our teachers to track the learning outcomes every day.
And if we have time a little later, I might come back and ask you about some of the things you've been doing with teachers in City of Buenos Aires and some of the examples of how you've kind of flipped that model. But yes. I want to go to Mesa next to follow up.
Well, I'm not sure how much I'm going to address some of the questions that were raised. I think some of them are ones that we're all grappling with. But I wanted to mention two initiatives that perhaps give a clear indication of how sort of the movement in skills is many times, skills development is many times reflective of the times that we're living in and what we're trying to make education sort of develop in young people. So I think two initiatives that come to mind that exemplify that. One is a new initiative that was just launched by the World Bank. It's called Education for Competitiveness, in which they're going to work across the MENA region to help prepare young people in high school and college readiness, and an initiative that my foundation is also working with. And that's really speaking to the skills gap and connecting young people to experience and to the marketplace, and putting in place measures to evaluate, job readiness and the kinds of skills that you need to work in the marketplace. And what's different about that initiative is using technology to bring that information directly to the student, and using teachers and the curriculum to reinforce some of those skills. The other is one that speaks to sort of the concerns that countries are in the Middle East have around preparing young people to live in a global community. and sort of the crisis around making sure that young people understand sort of shared values, global values. I think, we call them global citizenship. In the UAE, they've just launched an initiative that's called Moral Education Curriculum. And actually, I was just at a conference where they were talking to principals about what that means. And it's really very interesting, and I encourage you to look at it. And it's really bringing together some of those global competencies that look at the characteristics of an individual and how they fit in their community, and their responsibilities towards their countries, and also how do they represent their heritage and their values to the global community. I think it's going to be very challenging to be able to integrate that in the classroom and sort of for it not to be seen as yet another added burden on the teacher. But I think what's interesting about what they're doing is they're trying to connect the schools to communities and enabling the teacher to see that the role of civil society and the role of things like volunteering has an impact on what you're trying to reinforce in terms of values in the classroom.
Ramya, and then Darius.
So maybe just to address a few of the questions, I think there were a couple about assessment in general, and this question about looking at high-stakes exams and the extent to which you can assess some of these areas. So I think, absolutely, it sort of depends, I suppose, on how such exams are constructed, but I think when we think about skills like whether or not, say, in an assessment of reading, whether a student can read a passage and respond critically, showing evidence of critical thinking, or whether they can synthesize the information. I think absolutely there are some countries that have sort of worked in those types of questions, moving away from just a standard multiple choice kind of format, for example, in order to address, some of the additional areas. I think also we've seen in our region that in social studies exams in particular, there's some interesting space available for exploring some of these other skills and areas. So in Korea, for example, I believe in the Philippines as well. So I think there's definitely scope for that. I think also some countries, in terms of how they define their high-stakes exams, are now moving gradually to include a school-based assessment portion as a part of that would count towards overall the overall exam score or sort of a portfolio that a student has. So that's the case in Hong Kong, in Malaysia as well, where actually they've eliminated an exam, I believe, at lower secondary level in favor of school-based assessment. But yet this is carrying a stake in terms of progression and streaming to additional levels of education. So I think that's also kind of an interesting thing. Also, I think that now with all the conversations going on about, even in some of these international and regional assessment programs, including additional areas such as the global competence in PISA 2018, or actually in Southeast Asia, there's a primary learning metric that will start in 2018 for grade 5, including reading, writing, maths, but also global citizenship. Quite interestingly. So I think the fact that even, as Mercedes was saying, even though these are kind of the larger international regional programs, it's sort of creating this interest that's also, I think, compounded by the fact that we didn't talk much about the SDGs, but we have the target 4.7 that focuses on global citizenship and ESG and all these areas. So the fact that countries are now actually going to have to be reporting on this, I think, is also kind of spurring new interest. And also, like the colleague from, I think, Education International said, looking at more formative ways of assessing some of these areas, whether, performance assessment or portfolio assessments or other things. Also, there was a comment that I totally agree from the colleague from India about the disconnect, I suppose, between teacher training and then how teachers can actually teach these skills. Because indeed, I think in most teacher training institutions, there's very much still a focus on kind of lecture-based, rote learning. But if you're trying to teach students to be creative and innovative, obviously that's not probably the best way to go about that. So that's something that we have to address, I think, further. And then lastly, there was an interesting comment about higher education and how, for example, university entrance, still prioritizes very much, exam scores and things like that. And I think that's absolutely true, and it's kind of funny because on the one hand, universities and employers are telling us that they want students that are holistic and that can do a broad range of things, but then admission requirements are maybe still quite traditional. But interestingly, in our region, I think we have seen in the cases of a few countries attempts to kind of look at that in a different way and sort of reduce the weight of entrance exams to look more at other areas such as extracurriculars, participation in community service, and other things. In Korea, for example, actually, there's a new reform where at the lower secondary level, actually, they have an exam-free semester, kind of responding to criticisms about all the stress that students face. And so this space is now given more towards focusing on extracurriculars and other types of hands-on sort of experiential learning activities. So we're also working on this by a new project that we have focusing on actually happiness and well-being in education, very much driven kind of by the positive psychology movement. So this is something that's sort of gradually picking up traction in our region, and so maybe that would address to some extent this disconnect with university and higher education.
Yeah, I think the question by Josh is interesting. Let's see whether we can make a landing from 10,000 meters. And it's always a discussion of the system versus the classroom. But my thinking is that classroom solutions are part of the system solutions. And just giving an example of soccer. A decade ago, the Arsenal Football Club had the tag, the Untouchables, the Invincibles. They went through the Premier League season without any defeat. They won the Premier League. The same coach who was coaching them back then is the same coach today, and the fans are saying he must go. This is Arsene Wenger. What happened is he's been using the same system, the same style. Maybe it's the players who've changed, but it's the same system that he used a decade ago and won the championship without losing a game. How did it all go wrong? What happened? And it's this issue of value chain. Simple thing, Leicester won the Premier League last year. This year, they are struggling to keep up with the pace. They are the champions last year. What happened last year? Was it by luck? Then the same issue that comes in. Governments are always scared about giving you freedom to do what you want, because they want to know what you're doing in that classroom. Guess what? In our reform process, we have made a provision for 10% county-specific curriculum content. We are allowing for counties and schools to have whatever they want in the curriculum. But even that 10%, we are worried on what are they going to do with the 10%? How are they going to do that? And I got into problem for teaching what was not in the curriculum. And in some countries, you can be arrested for teaching outside the curriculum. And I thought if I change the curriculum, then it will be flexible and open enough for teachers to experiment. It's still a challenge because the policymaker has to make that decision. Guess what? Now I'm the policymaker. And I'm wondering, I'm wondering whether I should make that decision or I should advise that we should take this decision and allow the teacher to decide. Because if you're going to teach nationalism, what kind of nationalism is Josh going to teach? It might be firebrand nationalism. And is it going to build the country? So it's a tricky situation, but we are cognizant of the fact that there's a system and classroom solution. But our approach is that the classroom solutions are part of the system solution, the little bits and pieces that make up the system solution. And we are hoping it can contribute towards that. When we discuss about the case of teachers, interestingly, the key question is who trains teachers? And what kind of training do they have, the teacher trainers? So that if you expect the training to be different, then that person who is training the teachers has to understand that you've changed. But you realize that in the university, in our case, the universities are autonomous. So they will tell you it's the Senate to decide. The university council will decide on what is going to be offered in the university. So some university, it's knowledge for knowledge's sake. And we have no problem with that. But what is the reality? In most African countries, getting 12 years of continuous basic education is a challenge. So forget about university for the time being. The 12 years of continuous basic education, what does the child acquire from that? How do they fit in the society? Because in a situation where a university produces one engineer, how many technicians does this engineer require? How many artisans or how many craftsmen does this engineer require? So we are focusing on secondary and TVET so that there will be enough technicians and enough artisans and craftsmen to work with this one engineer that is produced by the university. In any case, university education in most of our cases, it's elite. It's for the elite, the top cream who make it through the cutthroat competition that is national examinations. The bulk go into tertiary level. The other bulk do not even go to post-secondary training. So we are now revitalizing TVET as a solution to the industrial issues we are thinking. When we think about skills that are employable, then we have got to promote TVET as an option. We are not disregarding university, but we are hoping university will come around to the thinking that as much as they are autonomous, they have to look at the situation in the given country. And yes, Henry, social and emotional area. In Kenya, we have an example of a program we are calling Learning to Live Together, where it's student self-assessment, it's peer assessment, where it is the students who are able to tell how it is that they can live together harmoniously. But you've got to give them a framework, you've got to give them tools, support the teacher to create an environment for children to do that. And lastly, Margaret, you talk about evidence in implementing reforms. We suffer from too much evidence. Too much evidence. Everyone has done research, everyone has got this evidence, and it's piled up on our shelves. The question is, how do we translate this evidence into practical strategies that make differences? And I agree, that have impact in our countries. Evidence is huge. Kenya has got so many pilots that are going on these skills or that skills and the other, and the evidence is huge. But the question is, what happens after you get the evidence? What do you use the evidence for? And as I said, we're looking at the 12 years that this child is in education. Within those 12 years, and there's a lot of research evidence to demonstrate that if within those 12 years this child acquires the basic skills, at least they will be a productive member of the society. If I give an example of a female or a girl who at least acquires secondary school education, they are better informed in terms of family planning. They are better informed in terms of nutrition. They are better informed in terms of immunization for their child, better informed in how they at least enable their children to access education. For us, that is key, because that is the huge cohort of learners we are looking at. The universities are doing so well. We are producing excellent people from the universities, but we are working with the universities to change their training so that the competences that graduates come out with. Interestingly, a graduate from university and a graduate from a TVET institution, some employers will prefer the one from a TVET institution. Why? The one from university is more theoretical. The one from a TVET institution is more practical and hands-on. So that's the kind of balance we are looking at, and hopefully it's going to work somehow.
Yeah. So we're just out of time. Can I just have all the panelists say one kind of final sentence on what you want to see in the future in regard to skills for the children in your region? So maybe start with Mercedes. One sentence.
No, just we have a long way to go, and we are in government right now, and we have to be very careful of providing the right to high-quality education in every single public school in Argentina. We are not doing well in maths and literacy, so Although we are thinking about skills, that is why I am saying it's not subjects or skills, it's all together. And we are working very hard to improve the quality and the learning outcomes, but having a look at what is coming from the future. We also must be responsible for training our students to face the future that it's waiting for them, which we don't know how it's going to look like in 2030.
Romeo?
No, I think it's really this point about translating. It's great now that we're having these conversations, but translating all of that into the reality of classrooms and particularly teaching and assessment. I do think we have a couple of opportunities, though, in front of us now, particularly around the target 4.7, like I said, and the fact that now all countries are going to have to be thinking about, how they're actually, operationalizing this target in particular and reporting on that. So building off of that momentum for the next, 13 years. And also the other point is perhaps just in terms of regional networks, because certainly in our experience, having these two platforms with the ARINET and the NECMAP has been really key in terms of being able to bring countries together and doing research, developing common frameworks and tools. And so I think this is a really valuable sort of way of working, and I don't know if that's the case in other regions, but we definitely plan to continue to leverage these regional networks in terms of going forward and looking at more of the questions of the how and what happens concretely.
Final thoughts, Darius?
Maybe picking up from where she's left, we know so much about the what, and we are grappling with the how. And for me, it's that most African countries are open to taking the risk and working with the how. The key issue here is whether we can get it implemented. So much expertise exists, so much evidence exists. How does this translate into what happens in our classrooms, whether it's in Kenya, in Zambia, in South Africa, in Namibia, across the continent? How does this translate into classroom practice, and how does it produce the 21st century citizen of the world?
I would just say two quick things. One is I would love to see more persistence in implementation. Most of the countries in the MENA region know what they need to be working on and have the frameworks, but they need to be more persistent in following through in implementation. And the second is, and which we didn't talk about a lot today, is that we're all working towards the skills that young people need to have in order to face sort of uncertainty that they'll be facing in 2030. But I think that we need to be preparing them for uncertainty today. And in the MENA region, where so many of the young people are refugees or displaced or living in conflict, they need to be able to have the skills today to survive in a very uncertain world.
Thank you. Let's give a round of applause for our panelists.